From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson, presented by the Center for American Institutions at Arizona State University. Joining me today from beautiful Central Florida at Hamilton College at the University of Florida is Dr. Rebeca Leffler. Dr. Leffler, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Leffler, this is your first year at Hamilton College, right?
This is my first year at Hamilton School.
Hamilton School, sorry, my
Hamilton
mistake.
School of Classical and Civic Education. And I was actually at Hamilton College in upstate New York for 2 years, 2022 to 2024.
Okay,
So lots of
I mean, yeah, Hamilton, New York is a lot like Gainesville, right?
Um, yeah, so, interestingly, Hamilton College is not in Hamilton, New York. It's in Clinton, New York. And Colgate is in Hamilton, New York. So
Okay,
there's a lot of
that's my
Hamiltons,
confusion.
but yeah, yeah. But yeah, we're
Okay,
in North Central Florida and very, very different. I think we're in the 80s this week. And at Hamilton College, you probably would get to the 80s in late June, early July, maybe.
there's also probably fewer gators in Hamilton, in Clinton, New
Yeah.
York, than there are in Gainesville, Florida.
Yeah, I think there's thousands of gators here just in Gainesville
Yeah,
alone.
yeah, safer to let your cats out at night in Clinton, New York, than maybe in Gainesville.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. No, no gators to get them, although maybe a wolf or two.
Sure, all right. Well, before we get started, we're going to talk about a really important philosopher in modern academia today. But before we get started, Dr. Leffler, you are in a really interesting program there at the Hamilton School. Are you able to talk a little bit about that program?
Yeah, so I am at the Hamilton School for Classical and Civic Education, and this is a relatively new school. It's only a couple of years into its creation. Over the past 2, maybe 3 years, they've hired about 50 different faculty members, focusing on sort of civic survival generally. I'm also within Hamilton part of a program called America in the World. And that is a consortium program with the other schools being Duke University, Johns Hopkins, UT Austin, and then UT Florida, or U Florida. And so within America in the World, we have our own programming, but then also since we're hosted here at U Florida, it's me and a couple of other postdocs and one pre-doc, we are also very much part of the Hamilton School and the Hamilton community. So I think it's a really great program, a really great opportunity, no teaching requirements, which is really big at this stage of the career to have, that dedicated time to just focus on your research, and also a lot of opportunity to workshop. So I workshopped my book proposal manuscript. I've workshopped also some sort of smaller articles that I'm working on, journal length articles. So there's a lot of support for that and a lot of just like excitement generally.
That's wonderful. That's a tremendous program. I mean, what a boon for an early career scholar to get that opportunity.
Yeah, yeah. And the network, I think, because you're connected with, people that are studying. The American the World is on grand strategy broadly defined, but it's very broadly defined. So we have all sorts of approaches and topics that people are interested or writing about. And we have structured programming. So in a few weeks, we'll be going to UT Austin to do a presentation there on nuclear strategy. So lots of different opportunities to kind of expand your research, but then also to, the main project is turning your dissertation to a book or your major book project.
Wonderful, wonderful. And this is how you know you're getting a top-notch scholar, by the way. This is a very on this program, Dr. Leffler, who was brought in. This was a very, very selective program. There were thousands of applications. I know that, and only a couple of dozen people were actually selected. So, Dr. Leffler, congratulations for that. And
Thank
also,
you.
to our listeners, you know that we only bring the best and the brightest onto the show. Um, so, Dr. Leffler, your graduate work was done at a school called Claremont McKenna, and it has been I wanted to bring you on the show today because Claremont is so much of its identity is wrapped up in the work of one man. And I was hoping you could maybe give us a little bit of a background, and we could talk a little further about him, his work, and why it's relevant both in scholarship and public affairs today.
Yeah. So I earned my master's and my master's and my PhD from Claremont Graduate University, and so I do want to just offer this clarification for listeners that might not be familiar with the Claremont schools. So the Claremont colleges are a series of colleges, clustered together, all within walking distance. They share the same library. You can use, the same resources. You can often cross enroll in other schools, but there are 5 distinct undergrad colleges, of which Claremont McKenna is one. And there are also 2 graduate colleges, graduate only, which Claremont Graduate University is one. Now, so they are distinct, but within Claremont Graduate University, while I was there, and they have very recently, I think in the past, it was after I had left, but maybe I was still about to defend my dissertation. I'm trying to remember now, maybe 2022 to 2023. Claremont Graduate University has since gotten rid of their political philosophy program. And their political philosophy program is the program that I was in. They did not have any full-time political philosophy professors. So for the political theorists, us, that were in the program, we took all of our courses with basically Claremont McKenna professors. That was who served on our committee. Those are who were our advisors. And then, and I don't know if we'll get into this later, but there also is, not in the city of Claremont, but next to the city of Claremont, is the Claremont Institute, which is a conservative think tank. And so these are all different entities, but they all have Claremont on them in the name, so it can be a little confusing. But yes, I did receive my PhD in political theory from Claremont Graduate University, and I came to Claremont specifically to study political theory, but I had never heard of Leo Strauss before I arrived. We didn't actually read very much of Leo Strauss. But what we did do, and what I came to understand sort of as I progressed in the program, and also eventually did read Strauss in an independent study, was his importance in reading text, reading the great books, thinking about these things. So if I've talked for too long, please stop me. But I thought maybe I would do sort of an overview of Strauss, and then we can sort of talk about it. So Strauss was a German Jew, student of Husserl. He also took some courses with Heidegger. Although I don't think he was, officially one of Heidegger's students, he did sit on a couple of his courses. In the late 1930s, he emigrated to the United States. First major position was at the New School. Before settling in Chicago from 49 to 69. He also did a 1-year stint at Claremont Men's College, as it was called at the time. So Claremont McKenna used to be called Claremont Men's College. It was exclusively male only, although they eventually opened it up for both men and women and changed the name to Claremont McKenna. And he was, pretty central and pivotal in sort of addressing what he thought were some of the two main threats to political philosophy at the time, probably still today, which are historicism and social science, positivism, or a kind of relativism. And he outlines this in Natural Right and History, which was published in 1953, sort of tracing the different waves of the moderns and how they, address this problem of natural right or natural justice. But perhaps what he's most known for is his discovery or rediscovery, really, of exoteric or esoteric writing. And so Strauss calls it exoteric writing, but most people refer to it as esoteric, which is basically the idea that previously philosophers had sort of embedded in their writings two different kinds, or two different layers at least, of teaching. What would be exoteric, which could be easily accessible, right? What you would sort of deduce if you were to read the work. And an esoteric writing, which was a sort of hidden writing. There's a book that came out about esoteric writing, which is called Philosophy Between the Lines, right? Like very clearly captures what esoteric writing is. And that it was not only classical philosophers that did this, but also modern philosophers to a different extent and maybe for different reasons. And so he outlines this in a couple of essays, one of which is Persecution and the Art of Writing, which is basically the idea, and there's many different reasons, but one of the reasons why somebody might write this way is the fear of persecution, right? That in order to protect yourself, you attempt to hide what your true thinking about a subject is. There are also pedagogical reasons for doing this, right? That you might have some very ambitious students and to protect your students from themselves, really, you might make it so that the process of learning or the process of seeking is a slow one, right? Is one that sort of requires them to put an effort to approach the text with a kind of humility, right? That there might be something for them to actually learn when reading these previous philosophers. And that this way of thinking, and this kind of goes back to, one of his main, or one of the things that he viewed as a threat, which is historicism, is that this kind of thinking is anti-historicism, in that you're not, if you're reading in this way, you're not assuming that the author is a product of their time or tied to their time or can only say things that are relevant to people of that time, that they might actually have something to say, and this is where the esoteric writing is, that is, grasping at something eternal, at something recurring, at something that you could still learn from. And so, he and his students became very well known for their commentaries on works, right? So they would do a very, very close reading of a work to try to understand both the exoteric and also the esoteric lesson or teaching.
So, given that you probably sat in on a few of those Straussian style seminars where you would close read texts, what was that experience like?
It was amazing. It was amazing. So and I can talk a little bit. I'll talk about my experience, and then I'll talk, which could be useful, I think, maybe for listeners, of like, how do you actually do it, right? But so we did. So in my first semester at Claremont Graduate University, I took a course on a few of the Platonic dialogues, and the way that we read the way that the course progressed, Mark Blitz was the professor, was he would pick a student and the student would read out loud. And every 1 or 2 lines, Professor Blitz would stop that person and he would just talk and we would have a conversation about it, or he would raise points, as the student progressed. And so there was no like planned, lecture there. I think the grade was 100% your final paper. It was just reading aloud and moving very, very slowly, right? So you would maybe go through 2, 3 pages in, 3 hours. And talk about it. And so what I would try to do, when I would get home is I would think, okay, well, we're going to move maybe a couple more pages next time. So I'm going to read ahead of time, obviously, so I can be prepared and try to take things out of the text and try to engage with the text. And whatever I was able to pull out from the text always paled in comparison to whatever, Professor Blitz was able to pull out of the text. And that process of like learning how to read that slowly and give that much care and attention to a text, I think, that is the best way to learn how to do it, is by actually doing it with somebody that is skilled at doing so. And so not all the courses were like that, right? We obviously had to cover a lot of things, and some courses were more thematic, and I took American courses as well. And not all the courses were taught by people that would be considered Straussians. But that was sort of my first introduction to that level of care and attention used in a text.
Now, when you were in these classes, did there seem to be tended to be a focus on the classical works in philosophy, or was it sort of broad based? Did it, include modern works as well?
Yeah, so it included modern works as well. So I took a course which was similar in the close reading sense with James Nichols, who was a student of Alan Bloom, who was a student of Strauss, um, uh, on Rousseau's Emile. So it wasn't just the classics that we looked at in that way. And again, there were courses, and I'm sure, for your field too, there's like that introductory survey course where you have to cover just a ridiculous amount of content and history time period in one class. And so you cannot really, do a close read for every single one of those texts. But many of the classes were like that. And so another example is I took a course on the Federalist Papers with Dr. Kessler, Charles Kessler. And I think we maybe got to Fed 10, which is obviously the most well-known Fed paper, maybe like week 7 or 8. Because we were doing a close read of all the papers up till the end. I think there's like 73 Fed papers. So we kind of zoomed towards the end, but we did a very close read at the beginning.
So you were taking longer to read it than they took to write it.
Yeah, right. That's a good one.
Yeah, anyway, that's what jumped in my head there. Um, the no, but that's fascinating. So when you do a close read like that, what are the sorts of things that you end up appreciating compared to me, who, let's say, I read the Federalist Papers and I've breezed through them many times, carefully read most of them, I hope, but not at that pace. Like, what's the doesn't I'm not necessarily making you pick the Federalist Papers, but what sort of things do you pick up when you do it at that pace versus, let's say, a normal scholarly reading pace?
Yeah, so you pick up some of the I guess the way to answer that question, or a way to answer that question, is to talk about sort of like what you should be, or what should sort of flag, send up a flag of like, this is something to think about or to puzzle through when you're doing a close read. And that is something like even something as simple as examples, right? So somebody, the author will make a point and then use a couple of examples to illustrate that point before they move forward. Why did they pick those specific examples? Why did they order them the way that they ordered them? Is there a really obvious example that they neglected to use? Or is one of their examples sort of a bad example in that it doesn't actually prove their point, or it poses a wrinkle to their point? And if so, why would that be, right? And so those kinds of things, right? That the sort of engaging with the text in the way in which you assume that, and again, you don't want to read this way for everything because not everything is written in this way. But if you are reading somebody that you think is a serious thinker, that has reason, or you believe, there's evidence to suggest that they engaged in this kind of writing, that everything that they, include is part of the thought, even if it seems like it's kind of like a throwaway line. And so that, I think, like, going through the examples really carefully, considering what the examples are actually saying, or even footnotes, right? Like if they footnoted something, or if they reference like, a line from a poet, but did they use that line faithfully to where it actually is, in the larger poem that they're taking it from? Those kinds of things, I think, are best done with this close reading style versus just kind of reading to understand sort of the general broad argument that they're putting forward.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I can really see how that would, you would gain respect. First of all, you would, again, appreciate everything that the author is trying to say, but also gain a whole new respect for what is actually being said. Because, I mean, I know this just from my own work, how often there's sort of this, it almost becomes a perverted characterization of a work based on like one paragraph that somebody wrote,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's the paragraph that somehow keeps going, that has stood the test of time, and yet it's totally unrelated to the point that he's trying to make in the whole general article.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or it's a poorly written, that sometimes paragraphs are drawn out from work, or sentences are drawn out from works that either, and they're done to dismiss this philosopher, they're done to
Yeah.
dismiss this writer. And it's like, hold on, yeah, okay, he wrote that, but like, he or she wrote that, but like, it's a part of a much bigger piece,
Mm-hmm.
where, and like, this is hardly, yeah, this this is like kind of like the worst part of the overall piece, and you're choosing to use this to represent it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I can
Yeah.
imagine how when you really get to actually like dig in paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, even word by word, you start to really appreciate the grander ideas at stake.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And appreciate how difficult it is to write this way, right? To that,
Sure.
and we're both, in our early stages of our career, and we're, transitioning to putting out things that hopefully will get published and have, wider range. But that when you look at your own writing, you think, okay, yeah, not every single word is on there perfectly as, you know, it's the exact right word for the exact thing that I'm talking about. So it makes you appreciate, sort of the difficulty of the task that they had, and then understand them in a deeper way than if you were, as you said, only reading excerpts from them, or only reading what other people said about them, right? And so you're not actually engaging with the work at all. You're just engaging with.
Sorry, one second. Sorry. Somebody walked into the room, my little hidey hole here that I use for these podcasts. Thursday mornings I share my office, and Thursday mornings are a popular time here. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I
sorry
share
about
my
that.
office too. No, no, don't worry about it. We have the same kind of situation, but one of my colleagues lent me his office. So these are not my books.
No, they're definitely your books. Definitely your books. Um, so this is probably a good point to pivot to your work because I know that your work is on rhetoric. So
Mhm.
how does can you explain maybe a little bit about your own research, about your own work, and maybe how the Strauss fits into that?
I became interested in rhetoric because I saw that there were some uh, sort of opposing views of rhetoric. Like on the one hand, I saw that there was this kind of easy dismissal of it, right? Like it's just mere rhetoric, especially political rhetoric. They don't actually mean anything that they're saying. They're just saying what needs to be said. And so you don't actually have to take the speeches or the attempts to, persuade or appeal in some sense seriously. And then on the other hand, I also saw um, this kind of view of rhetoric as uh, almost having the effect of like manipulation or force, right? That it was so politically important um, that uh, it was like just an extension of politics. And so I became interested in sort of understanding rhetoric, not in those two ways. And so I looked back, um, and I think that's kind of key is, if you're interested in a subject, like look back at sort of its origins to see what the classics had to say about rhetoric. And what I found is that the Platonic dialogues have a very mixed view of rhetoric, and that rhetoric is presented by Socrates in different ways in different dialogues, which is, very kind of a Straussian, you know, purpose for that, perhaps. And so I engaged with some of those dialogues, but I really was interested in Aristotle's rhetoric. And for Aristotle, rhetoric is not so much words or even, the speech itself, although that is part of rhetoric. It's being able to see the persuasive appeals that are available in any given case, which could be a lot of appeals. And it could be, maybe you have one thing that you could really use. And the end of rhetoric is also not, or that the end of rhetoric is not to persuade, because you might not be able to persuade, even if you craft a very persuasive argument. And there could be a variety of reasons for that. And so I took an independent study on Aristotle's rhetoric, and we also read some of the Platonic dialogues dealing with rhetoric. I wrote my dissertation on epideictic rhetoric, which is a kind of ceremonial rhetoric that praises and blames towards the end of the noble and the base. And then my dissertation was very, very broad, very thematic. I was looking at this species of rhetoric in the American context, but kind of throughout time, right? So I did some speeches on from Lincoln, I did some speeches from Kennedy. Then I also looked at poetic depictions of this kind of rhetoric. I looked at Shakespeare's King Lear. And, you know, when I finished, when it came time to, transition to thinking about how I'm going to turn this into a book, I did not think that I would have an easy time finding somebody that would want to publish such a broad work, and then also finding a job, because when people hear rhetoric, they have this view of like, you're just analyzing the words and speeches, maybe, right? So it was hard to convey what it is I was actually interested in and what it was I was actually doing. And so I am still focused on rhetoric, but my new direction that I've taken my dissertation is I'm interested in rhetoric during the occasion of civil war. And so a lot of that is still based on my dissertation. So am not going to have to completely, write a new thing. But it is very different because rhetoric on the occasion of war is not strictly epideictic rhetoric, although it is a kind of epideictic rhetoric, it's blended rhetoric. So that is what I'm currently working on. I think that was long-winded. And then I'm also working on other projects, which include taking some of these sections of my dissertation that are no longer applicable to this more narrow focus, but that I still think, are important. So I'm taking sort of what I was arguing about the nature of epideictic rhetoric and trying to make that its own standalone. I am taking my Shakespeare and making that a standalone. And then I did publish an article in American Political Thought on John F. Kennedy and his use of Robert Frost's poetry in his Encomium of Frost after Frost's death. And that was a close reading of the speech because as I was reading the speech, I thought, well, he's using a lot of Frost, but how is he using the Frost, right? Like, what is the connection between the poetry that he uses and then sort of what Frost was trying to do in those poems that Kennedy is using now in this new speech?
Right. And I mean, I expect that allows you to come to, especially with your dissertation being so, broad, more broad, is that it allows you to sort of uncover eternal characteristics of epideictic rhetoric, or that are, and that's what Strauss to some degree was looking for, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right. He really sought to recover philosophy as a way of life, right? As this kind of unbridled questioning, not beholden to any authority, not even the time period that you're living in, right? And not even the city or the regime that you're residing in. Um, and, you know, and maybe this would be a good time to talk about sort of the students of him, and then, later the students of the students, in that Strauss did not write on the founding. He did not write on, um, you know, the United States and sort of their politicians or their political situation, but his students did, right? And then, even the there's a lot of disagreement within the students of his and the students and the students, the students of the students of his, on some of these questions.
Okay, well, why don't we dig into that? That's probably good. So, what do you think it was that attracted students who are interested in the American founding, or in the especially issues related to the United States? What was it about the Straussian method that you think appealed to people with those interests?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to study, you know, the classics and to come to understand sort of the importance of the regime in shaping the human character, shaping the human soul, and not reflect on your own city, right? That as you're thinking about these things, it almost becomes inevitable that you look around and consider, the foundations of your own city and your own way of life. And so, I think that is part of the draw of looking back at the founding, right? That it's significant that the United States was founded deliberately and consciously. And then, to consider, and this is a question, again, this is maybe in the weeds, but of, uh, you know, the relationship between the Declaration of Independence, right, which states these um, uh, truths, permanent truths about human nature, and then the Constitution, right? And so that becomes a source of disagreement between some of the students of Strauss on the sort of the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution, which is really just a question of like, what is the United States founded on, right? Is it founded on something that could be a kind of that could have some classical ties in terms of happiness, right? And understanding happiness and liberty properly oriented. Or is it, I think the famous line is on the United States founded on low but solid ground, right? And so that's where these two camps, like the East Coast Straussians, which generally, and again, this is sort of broad strokes, but uh, East Coast Straussians tend to think that, the United States founded more on low but solid grounds. And then the West Coast Straussians, which think, that the United States is the best regime, and that has to do with the way in which we're founded and sort of almost refounded again in a sense with Lincoln. So those are at least two of the breaks or
Okay, that's
divides.
interesting. Yeah, no, that's interesting because I do hear these terms West Coast and East Coast Straussians. I mean, I'm not in the Straussian world, so I don't hear them daily or anything like that. But I mean, I'm familiar with these terms, and had no idea what actually distinguished them from each other. So, are you suggesting that the West Coast Straussians are more American exceptionalist than the East Coast Straussians?
Um, Not that they're American exceptionalists, but that they,
And I don't mean that as a term of like I don't mean that term pejoratively. There's nothing pejorative.
yeah. But that, so for example, part of the reason that I think the Federalist Papers become so significant is because it is a kind of um, uh, it the Federalist Papers itself is a kind of philosophic treatise on the ends of government. And it also is trying to actually persuade the people of New York to ratify the Constitution. And, there's like a practical, obviously, purpose for it, but it has these two purposes, right? To kind of explain the Constitution to the people so that they can see why they should ratify it. And then also, it has a lot of philosophizing on what it means to be a human being. Is there a human nature? What does that mean for there to be this human nature? What kind of government what kind of government is best given this human nature that we have? Um, and so that's why there's that focus on the founding, and I think a kind of newfound respect for the founders as creators, makers in a certain respect. So I think there's, yeah, that's sort of the distinction I would make. I hope that was helpful.
No, I think it does. So I mean, I'm going to try to rephrase that if it's okay. That like the West Coast Straussians see the founding as sort of this philosophical project, and the East Coast Straussians see it more of a naked political project.
Yes, yes, I would say yes. And it, I mean, within Strauss, there is this, so the both the ancients and the moderns for Strauss write esoterically, but there's different reasons why they are doing so. And it has to do with whether or not philosophy and politics are, um, like, is there a chasm between them, right? Like, is it possible to use philosophy to guide politics, or is that really not a very good idea to even try to do that? And by trying to do that, you inevitably corrupt both. And so that I think is also kind of undercurring, is the undercurrent between the East Coast and the West Coast, because yes, they're looking at this particular, thing, but that's also the deeper question there, which is it, should, like, is that something that, we should be doing, right?
Right. So the West Coast Straussians would say that's okay to have. I mean, and I could have this backwards here, but that the West
Mhm.
Coast Straussians are saying, like, that there is this relationship between philosophy and politics, and that's okay. Whereas the East Coast Straussians are saying, no, by doing this, you're corrupting both.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
And here's the thing.
yeah.
Here's the thing. All right, we're talking about academic disagreements here, and so for people, you and I are trying to exactly discern what this difference is. And
Hmm.
meanwhile, like most people who are listening are like, that makes no sense. Who cares? It's not really relevant, right? And
Yeah.
and yes, you're right. Academia is to some degree characterized by making, absolute massive conflicts based out of the most granular possible difference. And nobody dislikes each other more than people who agree on like 98% of things and disagree on 2%.
That's I think that's very wise to say that, because I think that's the case. And you can argue more vehemently against people who you mostly agree with than people that you mostly disagree with, because it's then easy to kind of dismiss them, right? Yeah, yeah. And it's uh yeah, and Jaffa was at Claremont Graduate University, uh, a student of Strauss. And in addition to these kinds of differences, which I think are serious differences, there also became a kind of personal um, element in that Jaffa's approach was very like abrasive. And so that I think also kind of made this divide more.
Are you suggesting that in academia we sometimes allow these rivalries and these conflicts to emerge because sometimes academics don't always have the best social skills?
That certainly doesn't help.
No, and that like a whole bunch of the problems that academics have with each other could just be resolved by like having normal social skills.
They're certainly exacerbated, I
Yeah.
think, by some of
It,
these
and
things.
that's probably especially true. And in the case of the Straussian camp, when I mean I understand that the Straussian camp feels that they're marginalized by mainstream academic philosophy, and that so you feel like you're in a foxhole with people, and there's small disagreements in this foxhole, and sometimes the personalities don't always work well, and so it almost ends up being this even more extreme fight.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I would say that. I know that um, Straussians were not well received initially, right? That there was like real pushback against them, that there was a real sort of uh, blacklisting, right? In the sense that a lot of them were not able to, uh, you know, find work in academia, and so they turned to work in government, and so, you know, those things are real. I think it's probably less so now than it was, decades ago. Um, yeah,
But I do think that, I mean, just in my own experience, just reading it, I do think that legacy continues a little bit, where there's this assumption that like there's this conflict that may or may not actually exist anymore. And I mean, and the mainstream of academic philosophy probably took umbrage at Strauss because Strauss was taking direct aim at them.
Yeah, yeah. Right, right. That if you spend your whole life dedicated to an author or a thinker, I should say, and here somebody comes along and says, "Well, you read him wrong, and he was actually saying something else, and it was only intended for, the philosophically wise," then that would sort of, you know, not necessarily be something that you are keen to listen to.
Sure. All right. I do want to be I do want to be respectful of your time here. So I want to talk about historicism.
Mhm.
That is one of the great criticisms that Strauss and his followers levy against the way that people consider works. Are you able to maybe explain a little bit of that critique?
Yeah, that historicism isn't just like historical knowledge or contextualizing things within history, right? Which I think is not objectionable. But that historicism makes the claim that you are always within your time, right? And so that you're always shaped by your time, your values are confined to that time, that there's no universal truths, that there's things that were true for that time, but this is a new time now, right? And so that even the idea of going back to look at classical political philosophy or medieval political philosophy, that's not, that maybe you'll do that as a kind of academic project to, you know, learn about what was going on in that time period, but that you wouldn't go back to learn something that could be universal or that could be, um, something that might give light to your current political situation. And so that's why he saw it as a great threat to the possibility of political philosophy. Um, Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, and I mean, I definitely think that it. We've seen recently in the last 10 years particularly how so many graduate schools that where they should be reading classics and they should be reading the ancients or medieval philosophers have basically wiped them off their lists because of the belief that there was nothing that they could teach them.
Yeah, yeah, that there's nothing to be taught, and that you don't even really need to read them to know them,
Hmm.
right? That you can read what somebody else said about them or characterized about them, and that is sufficient. And that is really, narrowing and flattening.
Sure. Well, I'll give you an example of something right now that just drives me nuts. Um, so Quinn Slobodian wrote a couple of books on Austrian economists and and people like F.A. Hayek, and one of them's called Hayek's Bastards, and there was another one called Neoliberals. And people are reading that and say, no, you don't have to read them. And
Mm.
like, listen, I don't actually have a problem with Slobodian's book. I think a lot of people do. I think that gets some things wrong. It's not perfect. Um, but I think he's an okay scholar. He's a pretty good scholar. But um, you should not think you have the hang of Hayek because you've read Slobodian.
Mhm.
He's far more complicated and far more nuanced than, and I just, that popped into mind because I saw Slobodian's book over there on my shelf. So it made me think that it made me think of that. But and so if you just think you can assume you can read somebody's perspective on an older philosopher, and Hayek's not that old, but let's say it's an even older philosopher, um, it you don't know what the subjective bias of the person who's analyze or who's characterizing it is. So you might be reading somebody who really dislikes this person and is looking to disparage it.
Mhm. Yeah.
And
And
so
I think,
if that's your only knowledge, then that's your only knowledge.
yeah. And I think too, that's also part of the argument for esoteric or exoteric writing, in that careless or thoughtless men are also careless readers, right? And so that you could have right? Like, what's the careless way of reading a text? You read the beginning and you read the end. You don't read anything in the middle because you think, well, whatever is important, they'll restate at the end. So you could put plainly in the middle your real thought, and you could be, you know, protected in that way because the people that are, you know, that are reading it might not be reading it in that careful, thoughtful way.
Well, that's a classic way to get stuff past censors, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
you put
Yeah.
all of you put a lot of Soviet work. There's a lot of really good Soviet work. You just can't read the introduction to the conclusion because the introduction is how this perfectly fits into Lenin's conception of Marx or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and and the conclusion says broadly the same thing because they know that's what the censors are going to read. But in the actual middle, it's something totally unrelated and really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great example. Yeah.
And so, but maybe some of them did too good a job of that, and so for modern readers, we can't. Okay. We do just have a few minutes left here. What would you say? You mentioned earlier that the Straussy, that Strauss is pretty mainstream, or relatively mainstream at this point, at least in certain parts of academia. What would you say is Strauss's legacy today?
Yeah. He's he's main or he has been absorbed, I think. He has been absorbed in the respect that um there is a kind of understanding now that you do have to read the primary text to understand the work and not just sort of the secondary literature, right? Um, I think obviously the main legacy would be this rediscovery of exoteric and esoteric writing. But I think also another legacy that can't be um, understated is his students. I think his students have been extremely influential and are still extremely influential. And then now, again, just based on the time that we're in, it's now the students of the students. But um, those would be the main things, that this rediscovery of a certain kind of writing, which opens up the possibility of true political philosophy. And then also the legacy that his students have had on the study of American politics.
Interesting. So we're also at this moment where we're seeing a proliferation of, schools like the Hamilton School
Mm-hmm.
in the United States, school that to rediscover or to recenter civics
Mm-hmm.
in university curriculums. We have one here at Arizona State University. We are
Mm-hmm.
one of the centers that do it here, the Center for American Institutions. There's another one there's another one here as well. Um, but we are it's this Strauss's students are very important to this. And I think staffs of many of these colleges at their highest levels. Um, what do you think is see if I can find the right way to ask this question. What do you think that means, I guess, for these schools? That there is a Straussian or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the Straussian legacy, I see it as bigger in my head than it actually is.
Yeah, I think yeah, we're in the middle of a civic survival, and there are a lot of civics programs being developed in many different states in many different ways. And I think that's kind of key is it's hard to know, A, because we're so early on into this program, and then B, because some of them are, done differently than others in terms of being mandated by the state legislature, being, reliant on private funding. So because of all the different ways in which they're made and the different focuses, right? So here at Hamilton, it's classical and civic education, but there also is, with America in the world, and also a new major that they're making, war strategy and statecraft, a kind of focus on like foreign policy and looking outside of just the United States. Um, so, maybe this is a kind of way to not make an answer, not give an answer, but I think it's too early. It's too early to know. Um, and, also, there have been articles in the news about infightings within some of these civic schools, um, factions already kind of being developed just based on, you know, what the direction of the school should be, those kinds of things. So I, I'm, I don't know what the long term impact will be.
Well, the fact that factions immediately emerged makes me think of Madison's notion of human nature in Federalist 10.
Yeah, yeah.
Here's the thing: Straussians are, Straussians and academics of the civic centers are free now to factionalize till their hearts content.
Right.
Um, All right. Well, Dr. Leffler, thank you very much for your time. I think this has been great. I've really been excited to do an episode on Strauss for a long time, and so been so great to have you on. And best of luck there, avoiding the Gators in Gainesville, and we'll have you on. I mean, given where given the news cycle, given what's going on in the world, it would be great to have somebody on at some point to be able to discuss rhetoric. There is, as they say, there is a great deal of it, so it'd be great to have you on again soon.
That'd be great. I would love that.